Welcome to Proud Theology Revisited. This August is Pride Month in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we are excited to be contributing to that virtual celebration by re-airing our 2019 series, Proud Theology. This July 30th, we will kick off that 4-part series with a special 5th bonus episode featuring Mary, a member of our community who contributes much love and knowledge to this ever-evolving conversation. So make sure you tune in with us as we revisit this very pertinent conversation together. As always, we do offer some trigger warnings. There is mention of homophobia and transphobia and how that contributes to violence against bodies. And so please take care of yourselves while you listen. I hope that through this conversation, we can expand your theological libraries, but we can also widen our God talk as we continue to strive to be diverse and inclusive in our language, in our theology, and our relationship with one another. Let's get started.
Welcome to the Awakening Shalom podcast. The Awakening Shalom podcast is an opportunity for digital faith formation at Myers Park Baptist Church that accompanies the Awakening series, a year-long journey of exploration and discernment which invites all people to come learn about the current social justice issues of the day and how they impact our faith. What we are awakening to is Shalom, the Hebrew word for the peace and beauty that exists when we are living in right relationship with God, ourselves, other human beings, and all created things.
Welcome to the Proud Theology podcast. I am Mia McLean, and I'm here with
Ben.
And we are diving in. I just want to thank everybody who listened to our previous series, Identity Crisis. We've gotten a lot of feedback from that, and we're excited to continue having conversation that's exciting and not boring.
That's right.
Yes, we're actually having fun in the studio down here, and we invest time and energy in this, and so we have been very pleased at your response. So thank you for listening.
Yes. And keep listening. And we're really grateful for all the listeners who've come up to us and are sharing with us what they're discovering. Feel free to send us emails if there's something you learned or that you liked or that you want us to talk more about. Send us an email. Let us know what you thought.
Yes, indeed. So Proud Theology is a 4-part podcast series in which we'll be talking about queer theory and queer theology in the month of August. Now, many of you know that in Charlotte, August is our Pride Month here.
That's right.
Yes, and we're excited to be marching in the parade on August 18th, so
Yes.
we hope that you join us.
Yeah, there's some history on that. The reason that Charlotte Pride is in August is sort of odd. It's really for business reasons because there was nothing else going on in August at the time. And so when Charlotte leaders were trying to figure out, the first Pride events in Charlotte were actually in June. And there was the first one was not like a parade. It was like a big out in a field. They all got together, and Budweiser was the sponsor. It was awesome. Yeah.
Interesting.
So it was like this big, it wasn't really a parade. It was just like everybody gathered at a big field and celebrated together and drank Budweiser. It was awesome.
Okay.
And then from there, things kind of evolved. And so Charlotte has been proud to have their Pride in August as a way of giving people who want to go to Pride in other cities access and opportunity to come to this. And also so that Pride would not compete with other big Charlotte summer marches and events that they have in other months like June and July. So August is really dedicated to Pride. So it's both good and bad. And on the one hand, it distances us from the Pride month of June, which is sort of national, but it also gives us kind of our own way in the city of celebrating Pride.
Yeah, and I would like to mention that there have been other Pride events happening throughout the summer, particularly Black Pride events that took place in the month of July. And so in a lot of different cities, Black Pride is a separate event for various reasons, but ours here in Charlotte is in July. There's a lot of stuff happening around the 21st of July. So if you're ever into that next year to kind of revisit, you know, what's happening throughout the year. And in other cities, there's Black Black Pride happening in August. I know that's a big deal in D.C. around this time. So just so you know, we're spread out across the summer.
Yeah. It's also why we're doing the podcast now. Right?
Yes.
So it's important to connect those things.
Yes. And also our Loose Plate offering for the month of August will be dedicated to Time Out Youth. Time Out Youth is a center that offers support, advocacy, and opportunities for personal development and social interaction to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning youth ages 11 to 20.
Yeah.
And they also serve up to age 23 for crisis situations.
It's a great ministry. And we've had a long-time relationship with Time Out Youth, and we gave a large donation to help them begin to build the homeless center at their new homeless center housing at their new site on Monroe Road. And we've been doing some stuff this summer with them.
Yeah, we drove the bus. The kids had a summer camp, and because they had so many kids this summer, they needed an extra bus. So we drove our Myers Park Baptist bus to. I got caught in traffic. I picked the worst time, Friday evening, to go to Carowinds, but
oh my gosh,
it was fine. Anything to kind of be hands on with them was really. I think our people enjoyed it, and to be of service.
It's a great mission.
Yeah. So that's kind of our opening. For this 4-part series, I'd like to open with a quote each series.
This is new.
This is new. I stole the idea from the hit show Pose on FX.
We're going to have to talk about Pose.
We will. Okay. I love it. And they close with a quote, and usually the quote is by somebody related to the community, usually a queer person of color, or somebody who was a part of the ballroom community back in the 80s and 90s. So this quote is from Marlon Riggs. Marlon Riggs was a black filmmaker, graduate of Harvard University. A lot of Marlon's collection is now stored, I believe, in the Stanford University Library.
Wow.
He died in Oakland in 94 from complications from AIDS. And so Marlon says this: "It is necessary to constantly remind ourselves that we are not an abomination." And with that, I'd like to open up.
Wow.
Discussion.
What a quote.
Yes.
That quote reminds me a lot of a poem by Denise Levertov that says that it's necessary sometimes to reteach a thing its loveliness. Because of the way in which the world bears down on people who are different, who are queer, who identify in different ways than the normative identity of many within society. And so sometimes there is a need to rehumanize a person. But I think the difference between that and Marlon's is that this is sort of self-empowering, what Marlon is saying. I must constantly remind myself that I am not an abomination, which is the word that has been constantly utilized right out of the book of Leviticus and slapped up against different identities of people throughout history, American history, over and over and over again. And I think it's heartbreaking that someone would feel like they had to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I picked this quote for the first episode because I think that it's so heavily theological. And I come to this conversation from more of a pop culture standpoint and not from the academic standpoint of queer theories, which we'll get into a little bit later. But I come to this from pop culture, from being an actor and being an artist. And there's such deep theology that's not what you think theology is.
Right. Yeah, actually, I mean, when we read the book, The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor, who is not a theologian and doesn't identify in any religious tradition in that book, we learned more theology from her in that book than we have from reading a lot of other books that are written by theologians. So, I mean, I think that the point is right. There's almost like an ingrained theological tradition within communities of oppression that we can learn from.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I want to open with this question. Why is this important, Ben? Why is queer theory? Why are we having this conversation? I know that, Myers Park has been open and affirming since.
Oh, gosh, since 2000.
Yes. And so there are people
But longer than that.
Yeah, longer than that, but kind of officially. There are people who think we've already had this conversation. We're over this. Why are we doing this?
Well, that's a great question. So I think the reason we're doing this is not just because it's August and not just because we're interested in talking about queer theory and queer theology, but or that we think our members will find it intriguing, but that so much has changed in the public discourse and in our communities related to identity, to go back to the previous podcast, related to identity, and particularly sexual identity and gender identity. So much has changed, and many of our members, this is no fault of theirs, are stuck in time in the 2000s related to their perspective or understanding of sexuality and gender. There's been 20 years very fast development of theory around this that's been going on for a long time. It was before 2000. So, some folks in our church are still trying to figure out what the acronym right, LGBTQ means, right? Some still just use LG. Some really only understand lesbian and gay identity and have not really taken the time to understand what transgender might mean, what the word queer might mean. The word queer itself and the way people think about it reflects reflects the fact that we need to update our thinking on this topic. Sexuality and gender is a revolutionary scientific process of development of our understanding of that. We have had really bad science on sexuality and gender for generations. Because that bad science, as all bad science was related to a cultural, narrow cultural view about what the right way to be sexual and the right way to think about gender was, and these sort of natural normative ideas were dominating the scholarship at the time and dominated scientific discovery related to this. But since the culture has changed and the sexual revolution happened in the 60s, there has been a fast-paced scholarship. I've actually called it a Copernican revolution because it's sort of like when you find out that the Earth is not the center of the universe. And you go to the church and you say, I just looked at the stars through this new telescope that I got, Copernicus or whatever, and the Earth is not the center of the universe. It's actually the sun, and we're all rotating around it. And the church is like, no,
Yeah.
Or like when they find out that the Earth is not flat and people write those first maps and the discoverers come back and like, it's actually round. We can go from here to here and come back around the other side, and that must mean it's a sphere. And they're like, no, it's flat, and heaven's above and we're in here and hell is below. The same thing is happening related to sexuality and gender. Someone is coming and saying, actually, it's not static sexuality or gender. It's not something that just you're born with and it stays the same for your entire life. In fact, it is quite fluid, a word that's used a lot. It's quite dynamic. And we're actually all on these spectrums, right? And when you start to bring that to the church is like, no, there's men and women, and you're attracted to women if you're a man, and you're attracted to,
It's about procreation, so
right,
we
it's
can
about procreation
all
and
subdue the earth together.
Furtherance of the species and the building of civilization, and all this be fruitful and multiply, natural law, and I mean, just it's amazing the kind of constructions that we have. So the science and the theology are at war. Sort of like when Darwin says, no, we evolve, and you're like, no, that messes up the creation story.
Right.
This is another kind of Copernican revolution. The problem with this one, though, is that when we think sexuality and gender, we always think morality first, not science. We don't think biology. We think morality.
Okay.
Because we think sexuality is like a choice, right? That is like a moral choice.
Yeah.
When to have sex and who to have it with.
Yeah.
Right? It's a moral choice. We make it like what to eat.
Yeah.
But that's not exactly how sexuality or gender works biologically. That just shows our naive understandings biologically. So I see this as like a scientific revolution that has happened, and the scholarship on this has moved so fast. And I'll just give an example from my own personal life. I've been helping churches become welcoming and affirming for my entire career. That's what I've done at every church I've been until I came here, because they were already welcoming and affirming. And I had to do a lot of research on my own. I had to do a lot of development because my theological training within the academy did not give me all the resources I need. So I had to do a lot of my own writing and own reading and research on that topic. And I read dozens of books on sexuality. And then a couple years ago, I was serving on the board of the Alliance of Baptists. I went to a conference. And I thought I knew stuff about sexuality. And at this conference, my mind was absolutely blown away. And I realized I had so many gaps of things that I did not know. I didn't understand the difference between transvestites and transgender. I did not understand all the different spectrums, not just the spectrum of sexuality and gender, but attraction and other kinds of scales. And I just realized how naive I was, thinking that once I figured out lesbian and gay understandings of identity, that I somehow got it. And I was totally wrong. And that was sort of how I started realizing, oh man, this is a revolution, and I've got to catch up. And there's a lot of information that I don't have, that I wasn't given, even though I've been doing almost all my ministry since 2000. So things are moving so fast that even somebody like me or you, who started this in the present time, is still catching up to the scholarship, right?
I'm always catching up. I mean, I'm looking at these books that I've been kind of browsing, and I had already read some of the works, or some of the authors that we will be referencing in this podcast. But there are, you go to the table of content, and you're like, not table of contents, the reference section at the back of the book, and you're like, oh my goodness, I've never read X, Y, and Z. I'm ashamed. Patrick Cheng, who wrote, the writer of Radical Love and also Rainbow Theology, who we'll be talking about in this podcast, his the people he references in his work, I feel very behind, and like I need to be constantly playing catch up. So I can only imagine what somebody like, my mother, who's always trying to get the letters right. She's just trying to get the letters right is feeling. She's just feeling like this is happening very fast. And it's not that I don't agree or I don't want to understand, but this is
you're trying to tell me I have to use certain pronouns. I don't even know what the letters mean.
Right.
Now you're telling me about pronouns.
Right.
That's how fast things are happening.
It's evolving so quickly.
So we're doing this as a service.
Yeah.
This whole podcast series is a service to our members who want to be able to be more welcoming and more understanding of different identities, sexual and gender identities within our culture. These are folks that you're going to be in church with. They're already in our church, and we're so glad they're here. And they're in our workplaces. Yeah,
even the people who identify as one of the letters are asking for more resources. So we have a member here who emailed us and said, look, our library is outdated. We have not updated our resources, our literary resources on this topic, and we need to do so. And so that's kind of how the idea came about. A lot of the stuff in the library is from 20 years ago, and there's been several, like you just said, the amount of work that's been done in terms of also intersectionality as well, because a lot of the queer theory and queer theology of 20 years ago was very white-centered. And so now we have womanists who are saying we need a theology. We have Asian men or Asian people who are saying, how do we bridge our Asian theology together with a queer theology? Right. And so kind of this podcast is opening up that door and offering you all a chance to go to the library or go to Amazon and browse at least.
That's right. And one of the things that brought that out for me, you mentioned all of the references that Cheng has in his book, but throughout Cheng's book, and this will connect with a lot of our members, throughout Cheng's book, he references a scholar who many of our members will know because she's a part of our community. Carter Hayward.
Oh, yeah.
Is mentioned over and over again, and people will need to know the story about our church and Carter Hayward. So in the late 70s, early 80s, I think it may be in the 80s, a group of women in our church who were very progressive and forward-thinking invited Carter Hayward to come preach here because she was one of the first female Episcopalian priests in America. And between the time she was invited and the time she came out as gay. Lesbian identity. And the Charlotte Observer, along with many clergy people in town and people inside the church, tried to pressure Jean Owens, who was minister at the time, to rescind the invitation because she was LGBTQ. But, of course, famously, Jean did not. and he supported the women's decision and the invitation. And this was a big affirmation of the free pulpit for us as a church in our history, that we brought a female priest, an openly lesbian priest, to preach in our pulpit to our congregation in the late 70s, early 80s. Now, Carter Hayward is actually the sister of one of our members. So there's a connection there that continues to this day. And so she'll come to church from now and again. And she comes up over and over again in Cheng's research for having written a number of very important books. One of them is Touching Our Strength, that was published a long time ago. I have to look up the date of when it was published. And so I think one of the hard things about that is, I'm looking here, it was published in 1989, Touching Our Strength, The Erotic as Power and the Love of God by Carter Hayward. And in that book, Hayward draws upon Audre Lorde's view of the erotic as sacred and argues that God is not extrinsic to sex or gender, but rather God is immersed in our gendered and erotic particularities. For Hayward, God exists in the connection that women have with body and nature and darkness and moisture and dirt and sex. Now, talk about a revolutionary theological view. And it was published in 1980. Here's the problem, though, the trouble. We know Carter Hayward. We almost take ownership of the fact that we know Carter Hayward because she came and preached here and she's such a part of our church's history. But very few of our members have actually read Hayward's work.
Wow.
So we don't actually know what Hayward did as a pioneer in the field of queer studies in 89, so long ago. We imagine that because she came, we know what she thought and what she thinks, and that's just so it's part of this like fish in the water thing. Our water of our church community and our history is an inclusivity water. So we imagine that by being in this water, we're just constantly immersed in inclusivity and will learn by osmosis what the best of queer theory is saying. But that's not happening. We're swimming around in it and we don't know what we're swimming around in.
Right.
Like it's like the fish that goes by the other one and the old fish comes by and it says, "How's the water?" And then the fish swim on and they're like, "What the hell's water?" Right?
Right.
You know, they don't realize what they're swimming in. And we're swimming in a sea of progressive, pioneering queer theory going back to 89 that is a part of our tradition, but we're not super aware of, that we need to take some time to go back and read and carefully understand, okay, who was Carter Hayward in her time?
Yeah.
She's retired now, but her book is still being referenced in the best of queer theory today as a pioneering work, and we're not aware of it, and she's part of our tradition.
Yeah.
That's an example of how much work we have to do to catch up on this particular topic. And we can't simply imagine that just by coming to church at a welcoming church that we're going to, by osmosis, learn what it means to be transgender, learn what it means to be gay.
Or to understand, I mean, even the people who are very intelligent, I have some conversations with people who don't understand the correct pronoun for somebody who is transgender, right? And you're like, you have a PhD in whatever you have a PhD, right? But that's not how it works, right? You can have a wealth of a wealth of knowledge and still be very blind or very unaware of what's actually happening in present scholarship.
Well, sexual, what is it? Heteronormativity, which was coined, I can't remember who coined it. Lightsey talks about it early on in her book. But heteronormativity is imposed upon us so often that
Michael Warner.
Okay, Michael Warner. Yeah, I knew it was in Lightsey's first couple of pages there. So that heteronormativity, which is the normativeness of heterosexuality, both gender and sexuality, cisgender, which we'll talk about a little bit what that means later, and heteronormativity are imposed on us so often that even once we feel like we've made space in our understanding for lesbian and gay, the normativity comes back in again and narrows our view over and over again. We watch TV, we walk down the street, we go to work, all these places where there are queer people, but there's also heteronormativity being driven upon us by an ad on the TV that has the perfect family of two people, a husband and a wife and their kids, or the sitcom that we watch that has that kind of normative family dynamic in it.
Or when you go to a church and the preacher says, "My brothers and sisters."
Woo, say more.
I mean, that's a common, like, it's like a very common phrase. Brothers are in the Bible when it says something about men, right?
Yes.
The sons of man, or right. There's these little phrases that even I remember I preached a sermon 2.5 years ago, and I said something, "My brothers and sisters," and that wasn't even on my radar 2.5 years ago. And then as I read more, I was like, oh, I can't say that anymore, or I should not say that anymore. And that's heteronormative language.
Right, and it's not that hard. Like somebody told me when I was doing it, say siblings. Yeah.
Friends, beloved, something.
Yeah.
Just there's options.
Yeah, that's right. There's many options.
Yeah.
We have to be a little bit more creative in how we talk so that we're not continuing to reinforce heteronormativity throughout the world. So I use Hayward as a point for us to realize, that was a point in time where we got it as a church, and we were welcoming and we were affirming, but we didn't do the work of continuing on with the scholarship over the last 30 years. And because of that, now we have a limited understanding of a field that has exploded over the last 30 years. Yeah. So that's part of what the podcast is about.
Yeah, it is. So I want to backtrack slightly to get into some definitions. Okay. And I want to start with, because we've been kind of throwing around queer and queer theology for...
I feel like most of this podcast is going to be definitions.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and you will give us some good resources on how to become more acquainted with some words. Okay, but I have a question. What was your introduction to the word queer?
Oh, I'm so ashamed to even admit this. I'm really ashamed. You're not even going to believe it, I don't think.
Okay.
So when I was a kid, we used to play football in my backyard a lot. I was very athletic. I loved to play football and basketball with my friends. And one of the games that we played was called Smear the Queer. Have you heard this?
No.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound great.
It was not positive. So all my earliest... so basically the game was, it's everybody against one person. So you throw the ball up in the air, and whoever gets it has to try to run and get a touchdown against everybody else. And then once you tackle them, they have to throw the ball up again, and the next person who gets it. And so it's like 30 people on one. And so you get destroyed every time you get the ball. But the use of queer is this idea. Look, we're all going to attack with violence the person who is identified as queer, whoever has the ball. So there's this. It's already shame imagery. It's this, and violence is written already within it. And so whenever that word was used, it was always used in a negative or derogatory term, either related to this game that we played, or we would call each other that, like sometimes people used to call each other gay as a derogatory term between, you're being so gay, or you're such a queer, right? It was a derogatory term when I was growing up.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what I learned growing up mostly as well, which is why I struggled with naming the podcast Queer Theology, because it might be a turnoff for some people who really just do not want to identify with that word. People who are lesbian,
because the word was used in a defamatory.
Right. Yeah. Right. Well, my first introduction, I think, really was Queer Eye for the Straight Guy,
which I love so much.
Great show. I didn't realize how not great it was growing up, but it was. I mean, looking back on it, it was not. There were some issues. There's some issues with the way it was marketed and advertised. The lack of diversity. Yeah. But when it came out in 2003, I mean, it was things. I mean, I had friends who watched it. They were like, "Yes, we're watching Queer." It was like a thing. People got together and watched Queer Eye for the Straight Guy.
That's right.
And it was also just kind of creating this dichotomy that, which is not wrong, but sort of co-opting queer culture and creating this dichotomy where queer people were creatives and everybody else was they needed help from queer people.
And they're also in touch with culture and fashion, which is a stereotype.
Right.
It's not always true.
Yeah, and even if it is true, there's this understanding that we're getting help from queer people, but we're not actually affirming them. Right? They're our hairdressers, they are our fashion consultants, but if we had to stand up, church musicians, right? But if we had to stand up and fight for their affirmation, could they get married, or many people wouldn't have.
Right, that's right.
Right, and so it became exploitative. Is that a word?
Yeah. It's exploitation.
Yeah.
And appropriation of queer culture, right, by straight people for some other purpose. But then when you appropriate, you don't necessarily then have to humanize the community that you appropriated from and advocate on their behalf. You can just take their stuff.
Yeah.
And use it for your own means, right?
Yeah.
I don't think that's necessarily happening as much in the new Queer Eye that's on Netflix, and they're now in the third season, because there's a very humanizing element and a connection where they're doing work with people on their feelings about lesbian, gay, LGBTQ folks, and they're engaging in that conversation as a part of the work. It's not distinct from there, where you're appropriating culture, but you almost every time the person who is the center of their attention for the week says, I've never felt this kind of love and care from 5, gay guys, right? And what does that mean? And they do express what it means for them and their journey. Some of them have already been open and okay with that conversation. Others were not, and they came down a path. So there's more dialogue about it, which I think is more humanizing, but it still has this kind of capitalist, exploitation idea to it.
Yeah.
But
I think now that we're on pop culture for a second, now this is we're in a great season where a lot of media is actually being shaped by people of the community.
Yes.
And so it's no longer Queer Eye for the straight guy produced by somebody in a room who doesn't care really what's happening, but just kind of turning on the cameras and letting it go. It's actually shows like Pose, which is produced by Janet Mock.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That's Janet Mock's concept. That's her baby.
Yeah.
And, she's a very active woman of trans experience who gets to actually be at the table and make the decisions. And before it was very, very much an exploitation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're naming all these pop culture references. We're going to have to tell people what these things are eventually. But we can do that after we get through this. But yeah, I think I love how you started with this question around queer, because it's one of those times, like the word black, within the black community, where you see a transition from the word Negro to the word black within the black tradition. And the word black was, considered in some cases worse than using the word Negro, which is why you see Martin Luther King using Negro in all of his sermons, right? But there's a reaffirmation of the term black by Nina Simone and artists and writers in the late 60s, 70s, 80s. And that reaffirmation, sort of taking what was a derogatory term or a term of defamation and flipping it on its head and making it pride. So I'm black and I'm proud, right? Young, gifted, and black. Black is beautiful, right?
Yeah.
That's the same way that LGBTQ folks took the word queer and reappropriated it as a sort of an umbrella term, right? And I think that's really important that I love the way you named the podcast Proud, because that's sort of what they're doing. They're taking a word and saying, no, we're proud of that. You might not be proud of it, but we are proud of that. And so there's this self-expression, self-affirmation that's happening through that, the sort of taking a term of that's been derogatory and flipping it on its head. It's actually pretty theological too, because that's what Baptist did. Baptist was a term of was a derogatory term.
Well, I mean, where we are now.
Again, but like Anabaptists, they were saying you were rebaptized. You're baptized again.
Yeah.
You double baptizers. You crazy double baptizers. And they were like, oh no, yeah, you're right, we are.
Yeah.
We're okay with that.
Owning
just
that.
Own it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's one term out the way. And so as part of the conversation, I wanted to kind of open up a little bit about who we are as we get into more of the gender and sexuality terms. And as somebody who identifies as cis-het, and we're going to unpack this, I feel like I have to always make it clear that, I am not a part of the community. I am providing resources and commenting on those resources, but and hopefully we will get some voices to the table. But I want you to identify yourself, and then we can kind of unpack this terminology for those who have questions, because I know they will.
Yeah. I'm like the normative norm of all norms. It's like white, male, cisgendered, heterosexual man. So it's what that means is that I'm obviously white and male, or I identify as male, and I identify as heterosexual, which means I am attracted to women. And I think that, right?
Yes, and I mean, Pamela Lightsey might push that further.
Yes. Okay, tell me what.
Because a lot of what she breaks down is that there's an attraction to women gender, and also there's an attraction to the sexuality of a female, like a female sexuality, right?
Right.
And
That's
so
right.
just to say that I'm attracted to women might not be clear enough for some people, right?
Because sexuality and gender are distinct.
Yeah.
And they do overlap and intersect with each other and connect, but they are distinct. So I'm attracted to a particular kind of performance of gender, right? That's what I think we're learning as we read this, is that gender is a performance and sexuality is an attraction issue and an orientation. And so there's important words there. But anyway, I am the norm of the norm and related to that. However, I would say that, and you can push me back on this if you think, I think we're all... based on what I understand of the definition of queer after reading this, and I think we need to kind of dig there a little bit, I think we're all kind of queer.
Yeah.
We can be queer, not just allies. You know, because this idea that somehow, unless we're right in the middle of every spectrum, like I'm right, or I'm on the far ends of the spectrum.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like, not the middle, but like, unless I'm on the far ends of the gender spectrum, I'm really, really male performance, or I'm really, really female in my performance, or I'm really, really heterosexual in my performance, or I'm really, really homosexual in my performance, then most of us are somewhere in this gray area, right?
Yeah.
We're all sort of in this queer space.
Yeah.
That's been created by this understanding that sexuality and gender are not static.
Yeah. I just want to kind of unpack the cis thing for a little bit.
Let's
and so Linn Tonstad, who is the author of Queer Theology, Beyond Apologetics, one of the books that we're reading for this podcast, Linn opens with a basic explanation of where that word comes from, where the term comes from. So Linn talks about trans-alpine Gaul and cis-alpine Gaul. Trans-alpine Gaul was on the other side of the Alps, whereas cis was on the same side of the Alps, the mountains, right? Yeah. And so that's kind of where a lot of that, the root of that word comes from. When you say I'm cis, I'm on the same side of what I was assigned to at birth. And if you say trans, I'm on the other side. Now that can be more complex than that, but that's basically what it is. And I think a lot of people, when I talked about this in the last podcast, when I was identifying myself as cis hetero, and somebody was like, what does that mean? Yeah. And sometimes we forget, because now we're in this space where we talk to each other, we, not just me and you, but people like us are constantly in conversation, but we forget that there's other people who
That's another reason
familiar.
We're doing this podcast, right? Because we're like, young millennials and Gen Xers are using these terms on a regular basis, and people in other generation gaps are like, there's a gap that they're missing. They're not having these conversations around the dinner table. Yeah. They're not using these terms in their regular dialect. So we're trying to help introduce the terms, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So based on Tonstad's definition, then, cis-normativity, right, is like heteronormativity. It is this idea that we imagine everyone is cisgender. You are only this you are either this or you're that, based on what I can see.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's whatever I can see is what your gender is. And so I push on you the normativity of what I think your gender is based on what you look like. Yeah. And or what genitalia you have.
Yeah.
Right?
And there's even a lot of, would you say cis normativity? Yeah. In the LGBTQ community, which is why, centers like Time Out Youth have a special time they call tea time for people who are identifying as trans. On the, trans can mean transgender, and we know it can mean other things as well. But they have a special time because even within that community, there's been a lot of tension between cisgender, lesbian, gay, bisexual people, and then transgender people who have a different set of complications when it comes to relating to the world and relating to each other.
Right, and I think there's another reason we're doing this podcast is because within the community itself, which are our members, are in this community, there is a generation gap of acceptance because, and I found this out at a conference recently where we were trying to pass a sexuality statement through the Alliance, which we should make available to our folks at some point during this, that the Alliance just created a great new sexuality statement. So we can throw that up on the podcast for this if you want. But the sexuality statement was opposed by some first-generation gay men who did not, whose way into the community at the time in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, was by getting married and performing cis-normativity. Right? Even though they were homosexual, they performed cis-normativity in their marriage relationships. Right, by saying we're going to get married, we're going to have a family, we're going to have kids, and people were like, "Oh, okay, you're a normal family." So there's sort of like this family normativity. I don't know what you would call that. That's like sort of imposed, and their way into acceptance in the community was to get a stable partner, one partner, and perform family like a heterosexual family, and that was their passing into the community of acceptance.
Wow.
So then when a new sexuality statement comes and it says, no, actually, you don't have to be married and you don't have to perform this marriage family, and it doesn't have to be one person with one person and all this other stuff that we could impose on people, and it's not static, then those who were accepted, those who found their one door, want to preserve their door as the only entry. It's almost like an immigrant that comes and they're accepted, and then they look at the next group of immigrants and they're like, no, you can't come in. You didn't do what I did. Right. Because it took so much hard work for me to get in. And this is played out actually in a really powerful way on the show Tales of the City, the new version that's on Netflix, where there's this gathering where there's this couple in the show. I'm not going to get their names right because I'm forgetting, but it's a mixed race couple, gay couple, and the black partner is much younger than the older partner has been in the community for a lot longer. It was in the community back when the HIV scare HIV was going on and all that stuff. So they go over to this party with all of the older partner's friends, and it's all white old gay men and a young black gay man, and they're having this conversation, and one of the older white gay men uses the word tranny in a derogatory term. And he's like, and the young black man is like, that's not okay. Hey, like, that's not okay. Yeah. And they get really angry. And are like, you mean here in this group, we can't be honest and open? And then they're like, you don't even know what we went through. Our friends were dying every day. Yeah, you don't understand what we went through. And the fact that I buried that many friends gives me the right to say this word tranny in a derogatory term because I'm like first generation gay community. Yeah. So I just think that that's a really important dynamic for our members and folks listening to the podcast to wrestle with, this generational gap between folks who were first generation into the gay community and those who are coming into it later with very different understandings about what does it mean to be intersexual, what does it mean to be welcoming to all people. Anyway, I don't know. That just kind of came up to my mind as we were walking through that.
Yeah, and I would even push that further. I would say first generation that was kind of like open, free in a certain kind of way. Yeah. You know? Yeah. And there is a lot of that pain and that hurt and this kind of sense of I survived. And which is, that's complex. Because that's a certain population that is able to say that they survived as if it's not still going on, because there's a huge sector of I would even say gay men of color who are still being diagnosed with HIV every single day, right? It's still a thing. It's not like I survived and it's over.
Well, it moved from being a white gay men's issue to being then a black community issue to being a Latino community issue. It's like continues to migrate and change.
Yeah. So it's all very fascinating, but also deeply theological, because the performance of cisnormativity is related to something that you probably got out of somebody's church somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So this is all connected. It's not like we're just sitting here having a pop culture conversation. This is very deeply interwoven into Christian thought in America specifically.
Yeah, and the church is the most guilty of putting a cisnormative and heteronormative sexual and gender identity on people. And creating this world where that performance is necessary. Otherwise, violence or oppression happens, right?
Yeah. Okay, so we got a little bit of the queer definition out the way, and just to kind of continue the conversation about all the letters, LGBTQIA, you had mentioned the website, Identiversity.
I think it's really important. So a couple of years ago, I was working with Ed Williams and some friends of his to help them. They wanted to bring some comprehensive education about sex and gender to businesses throughout the city. Organizations, nonprofits, and businesses. And they couldn't find any resources that had just strict education on this topic. And they came to me and they did an interview of me, and then they used that interview to go out and raise money for their project. And they got some big funders like Bank of America and others who are supporting their project. And these women are Sharon Blaylock and Krista Tillman, and they've been working with our deacon, one of our deacons, life deacons, Ed Williams. And they have, after 4 years of work on this, they've created a website and also some cultural competency training that we're going to be doing with them as a staff, and also hopefully our deacons around these issues. And the website is identiversity.org. IDENTIVERSITY, and we can put that out there on the website and our stuff so you can find it. And the best thing about the website for folks right now as they're following along the podcast, I mean, it just has incredible levels of information on all these topics: transgender identity, transsexual identity, cisgender, heteronormativity. And it has real people's stories, and many of them are charlatans. Real charlatan stories about their gender identity, bisexual. And then the best thing is at the very bottom, they have a link to their glossary of terms. And they have one of the most comprehensive glossaries of sexuality and gender terms that I've ever seen compilated anywhere.
That's amazing.
It's incredible. And they were like asking me about it, and I was like, actually, there's some stuff on here that you don't have. But so there's a couple things missing that they need on there, but they have a ton. It's really comprehensive. And so you're going to be hearing more about these folks who have been working on this from Sharon and Krista, because they'll probably be working with our community on some cultural competency around this. But this website is a great resource for folks who have questions about terms. They hear a term like cis, and they want to look it up. They hear a term like asexual. They want to look it up. They have all those defined on this website. Because we're going to use a lot of these terms, and sometimes we're not going to go back and redefine them in every episode. So we want you to be able to follow along with us by looking at this glossary.
That's right. And a lot of these books that we'll be referencing, they have their own. They do their best to explain it, but I mean, you don't want to waste a bunch of pages going through definitions over and over again. And so please go and check that website out. Okay, so we got queer out of the way. So,
well, wait, are we going to allow people to use queer instead of using LGBTQIA?
Well, I mean, I don't think I have the right to allow anybody to do anything, but I will say, because a lot of these books reference queer theology, I'm just kind of breaking down that term. I don't particularly use queer. I kind of just use the letters, but that's because I don't feel comfortable as somebody who's not quite a member of the community to be like, you have to do X, Y, or Z. I feel like if,
it's whose job is it to tell us what's comfortable. Really, it's important for folks to do that work individually. Some people don't want to be called queer, and this is going to be a part of our constant conversation as we go through. When it boils down to it, it's always self-identification. not other identification. All forms of heteronormativity and cisnormativity demand othering, other identification. There is a top-down, we tell you what you are based on what we see, and you have to deal with it. That's oppression.
Yeah.
What's not oppression is self-determination. And so when an individual gets to decide, this is who I am, that's what they are.
Yeah.
We don't get to say, no, you're not. That's oppression. So that's a really important thing that's, I think, embedded in all LGBTQ affirmation and queer affirmation, is to say, allow people to self-identify and trust that and affirm that.
Yeah.
Even if it changes.
Right.
Because that's up to them.
Yeah.
So if somebody says to you, I identify as bisexual, that's what they are. Or they say, my name is now Karen, that's what they are.
Yeah, and you don't get to
say no. Your name's Tom. No, it's Karen now.
Yeah.
That's really important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But for the purposes of talking about this, I think that Lightsey identifies as a black woman who is lesbian.
Yes.
But of course, she has to sell her book. So there's that, too, the conversation. So, we'll get into the definition of queer theology, I'm sure, more in-depthly on the next episodes. But, Patrick Cheng and Pamela Lightsey got to sell their books.
That's right.
And so, and if Linn Tonstad named it Queer Theology, guess what's going to sell the book?
Yeah, queer
theology, right. Yeah. She can't say, this is lesbian theology. She could, but there's also kind of top-down powers that be that are telling people what's the word that's going to be eye-catching. And, we have popular shows like Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, so now that's eye-catching.
Part of what that helps to identify and define queer in a different way, and hopefully this will lead us into some more discussion of Cheng, is when you say queer, you're not just saying umbrella for LGBTQ. You kind of are. Yeah. But you're not. But you are. So it can be an umbrella term for all folks that are in that community. But what you're really saying is it is the opposite of normativity. Anything that is not normative is queer. Right? It is a performance against normativity. Not because it necessarily wants to be, but because normativity is often oppressive in that way. So this is the dominant, even dominant may be better than normative. This is the dominant way we think about gender, male, female. If you don't fit, you're queer. Yeah. This is the dominant way we think about sexuality. Same thing, right? Yeah. Attraction, marriage, family, reproduction, etc. If you don't fit, you're queer. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Good. Yeah, I think that what will be helpful to people as we go forward will be helping them understand what is the kind of definition of queer, then what is queer theory, then what is queer theology, and that's kind of what we're going to do as we go through, is break down the differences between those. Absolutely. Well, I think we might have come toward the end of this episode. Yeah. I'm glad that we really spent some time fleshing out queer, though. I think that was very helpful, and I think that we'll be able to dive more deeply into queer theory and queer theology. Yeah. And so that people can understand the different parts of the definitions that we're talking about. Yeah. And I think before we close, let's make sure folks have all the resources. Yeah. So the books. Talk about the books first, and then we'll talk about the website and also the popular stuff that we'll want people to listen to. Yes, popular stuff is my favorite. So Our Lives Matter is a womanist queer theology that's written by Dr. Pamela R. Lightsey. You can find it on Amazon or Barnes & Nobles. We also have an introduction to queer theology, Radical Love, which is by Dr. Patrick Cheng, who is also an Episcopal priest. Just to mention, Pamela Lightsey came out of recently. She talks a lot about Wesleyan thought because she was Methodist. Now, of course, she's not really a part of that community as they're undergoing not anymore the transitions that they're experiencing. And then the final book was for this particular podcast is Linn Tonstad, Queer Theology Beyond Apologetics. I would say that's a very formational text. And Linn talks a lot about definitions, as you heard when I was talking about cis-alpine and trans-alpine. That's very deeply important that people understand
what is being talked about before
Yeah.
diving into any kind of theory or theology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can read those books as you follow along, but if you don't have time to read those books, we want you also to access our conversations regardless and go to the website Identiversity and utilize that and look at their glossary of terms and kind of read through those and understand what those terms mean. I think you'll be surprised at the plethora of definitions in that glossary that are important for us to grapple with as we go through this podcast, and I think anybody, even those in the LGBTQ community, will be surprised at how many different things are on that list.
Yeah.
And then the other thing we want to just put out there is all the resources in pop culture right now for wrestling with, I think of these as artistic ways of accessing the conversation. So you've mentioned Pose. You got to talk about Pose.
So Pose is a TV show on FX. It's in its second season. I am caught up, all caught up. Oh. The first season entirely is on Netflix. So if you have Netflix, go look it up.
Yes.
But I've been buying every episode on Amazon Prime for season 2 because I don't have TV. I have all the
That's a
Roku and stuff.
Millennial Gen X thing. We don't have television. We just have Netflix.
Yeah, basically. So I've been buying all season 2. It hits on some really important things, and I would recommend before watching Pose, watching a documentary on Netflix called Paris is Burning. Okay, because there's some people who have seen Pose but who haven't seen Paris is Burning, and Pose references Paris is Burning throughout. There are characters who are literally shaped around the characters of Paris is Burning,
yes.
Which was a documentary done in 1990, produced in 1990, that talks about underground ballroom culture in New York City, which is predominantly people of color who fall into the category of the letters LGBTQ.
Yes, that's what Pose is all about.
Yes.
It's an artistic performance of Paris is Burning. Yeah.
Right, and I mean,
so beautiful.
It talks
dancing is amazing. The costumes.
Billy Porter is my favorite person. MJ Rodriguez.
It won an Emmy,
I think he is up for another something.
The first season won an Emmy, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a phenomenal show. Of course, Janet Mock is at the helm of this, and so that's really, to have a trans woman be a producer. This is a big move in media
and
right now.
It deals with HIV/AIDS.
Yes.
Throughout the show.
Yeah.
But I think the connection of race, class, gender, sexuality. It is so intersectional through the whole show.
And the theology is interwoven throughout that. Some of the things they say about themselves and wanting to overcome the oppressive theologies of their past. People leaving their homes, getting kicked out of their homes because their parents thought they were going to go to hell.
There's so much there. We can spend a whole podcast.
I mean,
on
yes.
We're going to talk about it again, but I have so much going on in my brain. But we got to tell you the other resources that we have too. So there's Pose. We want you to be thinking about. There's a show Tales in the City that I would strongly recommend about San Francisco, gay culture in San Francisco. There's the original one, and then there's the update, so you can watch both. And what else did we say we wanted to? You mentioned the documentary. There's
also a documentary called Strike a Pose, which chronicles the dancers on Madonna's tour, which also hits on some deep issues about cultural appropriation.
And what's the documentary about the woman who was
the life and death of Marsha P. Johnson?
Yes, that's really important.
One of the catalysts, one of the major movement people in Stonewall.
Yes.
Right. This person, Marsha, didn't identify as, I don't think, trans back then.
Right.
But definitely a key figure in
Stonewall.
Yeah.
Which is important for our folks. This is the 50th anniversary of Stonewall.
Right.
Another reason why we're doing this podcast.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
There's a lot of resources out there, and if you find one that you want us to talk about. Oh, another one I just want to mention last before we get to the end is the show Billions, which is not a show all about this issue, but they have one of the most important non-binary characters, which is another term that we're going to work through. And this non-binary character, Taylor, goes by them there.
Yeah.
And is a hedge fund stock person on the show, a main character. And the way that the other characters react to this, to Taylor, is amazing. And it helps you see how important pronouns are, what affirmation looks like, and even though the show has a lot of other non-redeeming elements to it, that is one of the very most redeeming element to it.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking of pronouns, I would urge people to, do some work on that. And if you are comfortable with using them, I say put them in your email tag. That's one of my. I follow a trans person on Twitter, and they are always saying, "Look, the first thing you can do to help us out is to be in solidarity with us. Put it in your Twitter bio. Put it in your email at the end, right, and your tag." And so it's a the little things that really show people that you care enough to even be a safe person for them to be around.
Amen. That's good. All right.
Well, thank you for joining us for episode 1. We'll look forward to being in conversation with you again in episode 2.
See you next time.
Yes.